Hello and welcome to the AHR podcast, where we engage in captivating conversations about the built environment and its influence on shaping a more positive future. I'm Dominic Manfredi, Director and Office and Workplace Sector Lead at AHR. I've been designing offices and workplaces for over 25 years, and I'm excited to see how the industry responds to the social, economic and environmental challenges that is being set. Over the past 3 years, the nature of work has transformed significantly, blurring the lines between work life and home life. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the key office and workplace trends shaping our perception and interaction with workspaces in 2024. One of the prominent trends we'll be exploring is the growing prevalence of adaptive reuse strategies for existing buildings, examining how these structures are being transformed to offer the same amenities as new build opportunities. I'm joined today by David Porter, Head of Knight Frank's Manchester Commercial Office, who has been exclusively involved in office agency and development for over 25 years. As well as AHR's Head of Sustainability, Rob Hopkins, and Simon Lamprell, Regional Director and member of AHR's Office and Workplace Sector Group. So let's begin. Welcome, David. Can you give us a brief background to your role, please?
Hi, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to join you all. Yes, I've been, as you say, exclusively involved in office leasing development across the UK now for plus 25 years. My grey hair, or white hair, as my children says, will demonstrate that. It's really seen a huge diverse change, but I'm sure, and I'm looking forward to the debate and discussion around that. I wear two hats. I run the office here in Manchester, as you said, deal with office leasing development, but I also have an overriding role in overseeing anyone who does, again, leasing and development outside of our London offices, so across our 10 offices, which stretch as far north as Aberdeen, as far south as Bristol, which gives me a bit of an insight on what also is going on across the UK as well.
Thanks, David, and welcome, Rob. Can you please tell us a bit about what you're involved with?
Hi there, Dominic. Yeah, again, thanks so much for inviting me to be on this. In terms of my experience for today's conversation, mainly focused around my role with sustainability and how that blends into workplace. And so that's been through people's health and health outcomes, delivering well standard in workplace settings. That's now moved on to looking at net zero carbon, how that's impacting on our approach to new build in the commercial sector. But then also I've been leading AHR on our retrofit developments, particularly around commercial and city centre offices.
Thanks, Rob. And Simon, can you give us a little bit about your background, please?
I'm Simon Lamprell, Regional Director in the Birmingham studio. I've been working on numerous office schemes. A large proportion of these have been refurbishment projects, and interestingly, quite a lot of those have been listed buildings.
Thanks, Simon. Okay, so let's kick off with our first discussion point. So in terms of the office demand as we see it moving forwards, what's our general thoughts around how the office market is looking?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting post-COVID experience is probably the best way of describing it. I mean, 2020 arrived and we didn't think we'd let another single square feet of office again, with everyone desiring to be working from home post the direction from the government to work from home. But things have returned back to where we were pre-COVID quite quickly in our mind. And actually, what we have seen is the development and design of office space is probably being supercharged forward as the demand of occupiers has intensified. So across the board, doesn't matter which location you're in, occupiers at the moment, there's a huge flight to quality, there's a flight to flexibility, and there's a real demand for fitted space, especially within a certain size range, as occupiers ideally don't want to use their capex in fitting space out. Would rather a landlord did that, but they'll pay a premium for doing so. And more importantly, entwined with that is sustainability. So it's really the influx of all these accreditations, which I'm sure we're going to talk about, that pre-COVID no one really spoke about, not in detail, certainly not to the extent that we are at the moment. So there is desire for everyone to be able to occupy the best space they can afford in the best locations to not only suit their business growth, but also to ensure and entice their employees back into the workplace whilst retaining and recruiting the best staff they can.
Just what we're seeing in the Midlands, the other things to add into that would be there's still challenges around viability of schemes at an early stage, making those schemes stack up, making them actually happen. We've looked at a number of sketch schemes, but actually getting those going and taking them right the way forward is still challenging out there. Also, that the availability of grade A office in the Midlands is something that we're still lacking.
It's interesting, and to echo that point, as we're just shaking down the total amounts of take-up we've experienced in all the cities during 2023, and bar the odd one or two, the majority of the main cities are showing a decline in the amount of take-up. Now, that's not down to the lack of demand. That's really down to lack of supply and the lack of choice. We are very much entering into a pre-let world where occupiers are now looking into options available to them, and they may not have lease events that kick in until 28, 29, even 2030. They're giving themselves plenty of time to sort matters out. But it's also leading us into an issue regarding viability, which we knew was coming. Pick Manchester alone. There are 2 or 3 schemes coming out of the ground at the moment. There's no more plans to start construction in the city speculatively in the foreseeable future. And that is a concern, and we're going to see the space being provided to effectively satisfy this ongoing, what I would call stable level of demand.
Do you think occupiers are generally taking less space than they were previously, but there's maybe more people on the lookout for new space?
During the lockdown period, there was a number of parties whose leases expired, and they technically became homeless. And because they were so unclear and uncertain on the pathway moving forward about when they could re-enter the office space rather, and what they really needed, they then jumped into flex accommodation because technically they didn't have an office. What they've then gone and do is acquire what they thought was the right amount of space to meet their working pattern they introduced. That may well be people doing 2 or 3 days a week in the office and the rest from home. And there's definitely been a number of companies that have taken space less than what they had originally. But then we've found some businesses have had to then take additional space because the desire to be in the office has actually outstripped the amount of space they assumed they needed. So it's gone the other way. The majority of companies now are looking at probably taking around about the same amount of space they have, maybe some with additional to either consider a consolidation of other businesses into the same location. But it's more real, and I'm sure you guys have a greater insight than I do at times. It's how they actually procure that space and what they do within the 4 walls. We've seen a real imagination how space is being fitted out now. It's a kind of bit of a competition about the workspace against being at home and looking at a screen in the back bedroom or the office, rather than coming into the office and collaborating with their colleagues. So it's setting a precedent that you're better off in the office than not.
Yeah, I guess we're seeing those trends of having those additional facilities into the workplace to draw people out of the home environment and into the office. And then the office becomes a better quality environment, and therefore more people want to be in the office. And therefore there's now this cycle where people are looking for more space rather than condensed space.
What we've definitely seen, though, in the past, I would say 2 to 3 months, is far greater directive from the main boards of businesses for people to be in the office rather than giving them that flexibility. There's more stick than carrot to be in the office, put it that way.
And what kind of other trends are we seeing emerging for particularly new office construction, or are we seeing more people moving towards adaptive reuse strategies for their existing building stock?
We certainly are. We are certainly seeing existing buildings being repurposed, and whether they are the likes of former Debenhams or House of Frasers being sought down a different change of use. I mean, location-wise, they sit in the city centre, the majority, and they're capturing an interesting wave of demand. Or we're seeing existing buildings which still have a lifespan, but they don't have that sustainability and the environmental angle to them, being totally overhauled, because there's too much value still in the main structure to demolish. And there's also the discussion regarding the environmental side of that, but also speed to market. A refurb takes less than a new build, cost. And more importantly, from a viability perspective, we're seeing rents for the higher quality refurbs coming in not actually too far behind new build rents at the moment.
With that refurbishment piece, it provides something that you don't get with a new building. So existing buildings quite often have a character to them of their own right, and drawing that character out into the new design gives a USP for that scheme moving forward and can actually be really interesting.
It's actually going to achieve net carbon, not just in operation, but embodied as well as part of the actual works that have been undertaken. Rents in that building will be in excess of £44 per square foot, and the best rents in Bristol for grade A new space, again, net carbon space, around about 45 plus. So, okay, it's almost a new build, bear in mind the work they're doing to it. But it's just a really good example. It's not column free. It's got a sea of columns. So it's not providing that sort of column free accommodation that some occupiers strive after, but it's just got character. It's got design. It's got the credentials, good location, and people are paying for it.
Some existing buildings convert better. So there's some things that you can't change when you start a refurbishment project. So floor to floor heights, they are a given. The column grid, you have to work around that. You can move cores around, and we've done that on several projects, move cores around and make those more efficient. But you need to work with those. Yeah. So if you're a investor looking at an existing building to convert, there are some parameters that you need to factor in of what you can actually do and what you're actually stuck with.
I mean, again, from a sustainability perspective, I think undertaking those early stage feasibilities 10, 15 years ago, they would have focused on space within those buildings and then facilities that might be provided in the buildings. And what we're seeing now is the availability of tools to designers right at the front end to say, this is how much energy we think this building could save. This is how much embodied carbon needs to be invested to actually undertake those works. And so that can get input right at the beginning of the design process, and that's making a huge impact, I think, in terms of informing people on making really great decisions about existing stock.
What I would say is I don't think we've ever worked closer with the likes of yourselves in these types of projects. And it's really getting under the skin now, tangibly getting under the skin of what the occupier is demanding. So a lot of the kind of larger corporates will be issuing us with sustainability criteria that they want to see in their buildings moving forward, even questionnaires that we need to fill in. And we need to be answering all the questions correctly in their eyes before a building will be considered to be even viewed, never mind inspected. So I think it's working to put a design specification forward that's achievable from a viability point of view, but more importantly, it's answering those known questions we are receiving from the end user.
I mean, again, I think from an accreditation perspective, there's accreditations coming through like Neighbours that's hit the UK market in the last couple of years, where there really is no hiding place with those sorts of accreditation. They are very, very honest about what building is doing and what the occupiers are doing inside those buildings. I think other accreditations in the past may have given people a little more leeway to talk about doing something but actually behave in a slightly different way. Whereas, Neighbours is very, very, very accurate.
We're seeing an uptake on projects that use Neighbours as the badge and the guide through the design much more now. And that's over the last 12, 18 months. Neighbours is the sort of more of the go-to standard. I don't know whether that's across the country, but certainly in the Midlands, I'm seeing that.
Neighbours is a go-to standard, you're absolutely right. I have a bugbear with Neighbours, if I'm being brutally honest. I have mentioned to a number of developers, much to their disapproval. I would absolutely love to see a developer landlord incorporate quite strict criteria into how that space is fitted out by the end user. I think what our concern is, and the proof will be in the pudding in the course of the next 18 months, as you rightly say, is those occupiers that have sought a desire to take that type of net carbon zero, particularly in operation space, because of all the lovely tags that come with it, it's then actually, are they occupying that space in line with that accreditation, or are we actually going to see the neighbours' ratings being downgraded from the original anticipated 5.5 star because of the way it's occupied? That's how uniquely this accreditation runs, isn't it? It's done on post-occupational survey, which is unique in a lot of, well, in all accreditations I'm aware of. So we'll really see how this pans out.
I think it could be a really interesting space, that to, actually inform, as you say, what those fit outs are going to look like, what Cat B actually means. And it's no longer just about the provision of different workplace settings, but actually thinking carefully of what the energy criteria might be that are attached to those workplace settings as well. So again, it's another layer from where we've previously been in terms of advising people, is really getting into the detail of what it's going to cost them from an energy perspective to do various things within their space.
So in terms of, obviously, neighbours is seen as the kind of go-to benchmark at the moment, and you touched on a moment ago, David, about the scheme in Bristol where they'd actually considered embodied carbon as well as operational carbon. Do we think there's going to be a strong move towards trying to consider embodied carbon much more moving forwards rather than just carbon in use?
I think you'll tell me if you'll know better than I do, but what I'm being told is that a new build, unless you're building out a timber frame, is pretty much impossible to get net carbon in construction through over and above net carbon in operation or alongside net carbon in operation. Embodied carbon, because we're seeing a lot more existing buildings being repurposed, then yes, I think it's really important that is considered and at the forefront of the developer and therefore the architect's mind when we're putting these schemes together. There's some big lumps of space that aren't going to get knocked down because they're listed. I mean, look at where we are, in Manchester, for example, when we've got the Rylands building of 500,000 square feet of space of predominantly listed accommodation, which is being currently put into a mix of mainly offices, retail, leisure, with some possible residential maybe on the top. I suspect it could well be new build office. So these buildings aren't going anywhere. They're just going to have to be remodeled. And that embodied carbon is a key factor of why they could work for an occupier. I agree what you were saying, Simon, about reposition of cores, floor ceiling height, windows, depth of floors, how you bring atriums in, all of that alike. It's something which the planning authority are going to have to embrace, and heritage as well. Dare I mention them, about how they tackle these types of buildings, because we would rather they are reused than sat there dormant and being unviable and untouched, as some have over recent times.
It's interesting you pick up on that, David. We've had that very same conversation with the heritage officers here in Manchester over the last 6 months, where the starting position on a particular building we were looking at was you can't touch the windows, you can't touch the roof, you can't touch this. They're all within the listed. Our argument back to them was that the only way that listed building has any future whatsoever now is if we do actually start to look to make fabric improvements. And so whilst we were very, very respectful of what their heritage requirements were, we were looking to significantly improve the performance of the building, and they accepted that the science behind that, because of the way that it was presented to them, gave compelling evidence for them to actually let those works be undertaken, whereas previously they accepted that they would have put the brakes on and they'd have prevented that from happening.
We've seen some challenges around that, Rob, in Birmingham. On listed building, we've got a scheme in it, planning at the moment. It's a listed building in the conservation area, and we sought to add some internal insulation to the walls. Those walls, part of the building has heritage rooms, so we have skirtings, picture rails, cornices to the building, and the officer was adamant that they needed to be retained, and there was obviously no way of doing anything externally. So we did have to run an exercise on our EPC model where we looked at the building as a whole and remodeled it without adding the additional insulation to those walls. And we've still managed to maintain an EPCA, which is absolutely to my amazement, because I thought we never would. But that's down to everything else that we were putting into the building. But there are challenges.
I think one of the other challenges is the actual active sector of occupiers who are looking at space around the country at the moment. One of the most dominant sectors is both life sciences, which is another kettle of fish in terms of types of space, but also gaming. Now, gaming sector is gathering huge drive in lots of different, what I would call unusual locations, which is brilliant because it's regenerating certain areas of the UK that we didn't expect. So, for example, Leamington Spa has recently seen their House of Fraser being repurposed. It's been privately owned, taken back by the owner, and refurbished to provide 70,000 square feet of space, now called Bedford Street Studios. It's fully let, predominantly to gaming companies. The challenge there is not its overall design, its power facility. So they've had to install 1,600 kVA into that building, which is way over and above what a standard building would, because that's what they require. Now, you try and marry that power coming into a building with the sustainability credentials that the likes of neighbours would stipulate. And it's a challenge unless we're seeing these occupiers taking significantly more square footage that they need for the people they put into and thin that out. But you can imagine a gaming company, you'll be sat there with 2 screens, probably 2 PCs each. You need the cooling to support that, and the power that provides not just the necessary for your equipment, but also the cooling itself. So it's quite a big ask. But it's a dominant market. It's a growth market. But it's growing in the areas like Leamington Spa, like Liverpool, like Nottingham, and it's big numbers of people they are recruiting, but lots of overseas investments coming into these areas which aren't just the Manchester, the Birminghams, the Leeds of this world. It's quite an interesting scene at the moment.
One of the ways that we've been looking, David, to address that on particularly on buildings in Liverpool, as you mentioned there, was to look at establishing an energy budget per building. That means that you can have high energy use occupiers in there, but they have to get balanced out with other occupiers as well. And so then focusing on districts rather than specific buildings to say, we can have this provision, but they have to get spread into these 3 buildings, these 4 buildings that are next door neighbours to one another. That has then the benefit that they are mixing outside. There's place-making strategies for outside, and it's sort of bringing the whole area, improving whole areas rather than just single buildings.
Just going back to that example in Leamington, David, the other thing I found really interesting about that is Leamington now is struggling with shops and retail. So there's more and more of those little shops shutting down. But that office that you mentioned coming back into the heart, that town centre, brings all those people back in, and it's helping to rejuvenate the town centre, which is really interesting. And the other benefits, so when we talk about sustainability, there's another wider sustainability agenda going on there economically.
There's economically, absolutely right. Yeah.
So in terms of kind of workplace design trends and attracting the best talent to these kind of businesses, what sort of initiatives are we seeing developers and kind of forward-thinking landlords using to try and prioritise employee well-being and being attractive to the market?
I think what we're seeing is 10 years ago, it was all about cars and how many car parking spaces have you got in the building, maybe 20 years ago. As now we're looking at converting some of those parking spaces into welfare facilities. So that's the likes of the gyms, the changing areas, drying rooms, cycle facilities. We're seeing a whole raft of different types of added-on facilities coming in, even as much as golf simulators, treatment rooms, and then at higher levels within the building, then opportunity for terraces and getting a connection to outside is really key. the drive is about quality and outdoing the building that's just happened. What more can we put into this to attract people into this building?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. It's that wonderful phrase. It's kind of vertical bookending, isn't it? You want outdoor space on the roof that's ideally communal, access for all. There may be some form of pavilion-style facility on that roof that can double up from kind of breakout space to hosting events to theatre-style cinema nights, things, all sorts of different things. And then on the kind of ground floor, it's sacrificing perhaps one or even all what would have been traditionally retail or F&B units either side of a reception facility. If a building doesn't have a basement, that is, then to put in whether it be kind of co-working space, flex space, gymnasiums, end of journey facilities are really key at the moment. We are definitely seeing who can keep up with the Joneses and design the most unusual thing into space. So we're seeing saunas, we're seeing pop-up sleep rooms to recharge yourself. Our office here, even today, of just 20 of them have just been and done a yoga session in the building next door in a pop-up gym there is there. There's all sorts of, and like you said, there's then also those meanwhile uses where we see a real swap and change during the week. It can be anyone from doing massages to giving accountancy advice, all sorts of things. And it's really well thought through purpose of use of space that's flexible, but access to all. And those blurring of lines of putting a coffee shop in with no walls around it, that anyone, the public can use, not just the people in the building, having passive security rather than hard front door. It's a really clever, thought-provoking use of space that will not just act as a gimmick, but will be a draw to how an occupier will sell that space to their employees.
Again, something that we've seen is, what would have been considered just an afterthought 10, 15 years ago with a cycle space with maybe a couple of showers that probably weren't very well ventilated. They were pretty damp, they were pretty dark spaces. Is to completely rethink that now and actually celebrate people travelling in a more sustainable fashion to their workplace location. And then the change facilities essentially being hotel standard spaces where they're encouraging people to get changed, go out after work, socialise. It's not just about being dirty when you arrive at work on a bicycle. It's about the other end of the day and actually using the city around you and actually getting the benefit of being in town. Differentiated, what is the difference between work from home and work from the city? Well, there's a huge difference because this offer is right on your doorstep.
I think that's absolutely right, Robert. It's that quality that we're seeing. It is that boutique hotel feel. It is the towels in the changing rooms, the plants in the changing rooms, the soap. It isn't those two showers at the end of the car park that used to happen 20 years ago. And I've been around some of those buildings and looked in horror now at what they're like, and making a really nice environment somewhere you want to go.
It's fascinating, actually, and on how people are doing this. Now, of course, in every world, we've got people who do it really well, and we've got those who don't, but think they do. And these things don't come free. So you are sacrificing areas that you would normally have originally had in your appraisal of demanding a rent of X and capitalize at Y. But what we are allowing us to do from a sales perspective is the viewing experience of buildings these days is totally different. You spend the majority of your time around the communal areas of the building, and it's kind of sold itself before you actually take them to the office floors. That makes or breaks. You are compared against the amenity you're providing as much as the office space and its micro location that it's in, which is really, really important. But the key that is the follow-up. It's having that continuity, that space is maintained, it's added to, it's looked after. And we've had occupiers who have demanded that a landlord commits within a 10-year term, which they're signing up to always have a gym facility in that building, because that's how, and one of the reasons why they chose that building to go to. So it's changed the dynamic on how landlords review their add-on space, as I would call it, mainly the ground floor and the roof. And I know, too, it's a lot more fun. in working in design workshops and seeing how far we can push the envelope.
Another area you picked up on earlier, David, was mentioning life science as well, and another thing we're seeing, particularly within the last 2 years post-COVID, has been looking at the specification of these buildings to say that these workplace settings aren't just about desks, they're not just about meetings, they're not just about collaboration. The specification of these spaces means that we can put some laboratory type spaces and things that may have been put in a separate location 10 years ago, that might have been out of town, it might have been close to a university. Actually, it doesn't need to dominate the space, but it can be a complementary facility that's in someone's workplace domain as well, a little bit more technical.
So in terms of occupiers and tenants, what are the new hotspot neighbourhoods that they're trying to occupy? Recently, you've seen a kind of a shift back to the city centre, and in more recent times, we've seen a little bit more interest in some of the kind of more outer town areas that were previously shunned. What are kind of tenants looking for these days in terms of city centre versus out of town or slightly more fringe locations?
We've definitely seen a lot more occupiers coming into town centre and city centre environments, definitely. And they're using that as a sales pitch to grow the business, because their catchment of staff is a lot wider because there's more public transportation options to get people to and from home into the workplace. And also, obviously, the kind of the trappings of the various amenities that are on the doorstep, and city centre living as well. I mean, one thing that COVID certainly has done is pushed a lot of people from living and working in London to look at a different type of lifestyle outside of Greater London. And we're seeing some businesses now looking at growing their certain departments in a regional office or regional location rather than a London location, and that's down to the ability to recruit. That has seen a distinct change, and I don't think that will change. I think that will certainly see some legs in it in years to come. But the outer town market is certainly not on its knees. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to make anything viable to new build out of town. If you think it's hard in the city centre where we're seeing rising rents, construction costs don't drop if you want to build a building outside of a city centre environment. But certainly the rents aren't growing in a similar rate. That will change because the demand is still relatively healthy for out-of-town locations. But interestingly, we're seeing slightly different use of office buildings. So, for example, at White Rose Business Park in Leeds, the old Capita building there has been taken over by Leeds Sixth Form College, and they're growing. And they've got probably in excess of 1,000 pupils there coming in and out to White Rose to school every day. And education, interestingly, has been another growth sector where historically colleges have taken poorer accommodation in kind of tertiary or periphery locations. That's changing. Arden University took a building on Spinningfields recently with the recently refurbished number 4 Hardman Street. It's Hansa did, and again, that's a net carbon zero in operation refurbishment, and they're paying a top prime rent for that, which was unheard of 5 years ago. And that model's followed suit in other cities. Birmingham has seen a number of colleges come into place, likes of Arden. Global Banking School has taken space in, I think, 4 buildings now across Birmingham. And in Leeds, the Leeds Mathematical School took over the old Leeds Building Society HQ and have put a centre there, 900 16 to 19-year-olds concentrating on various mathematical science-led courses with a special focus on STEM. So there's a real interesting, different dynamic of use of space driven by academia. Why is that important? Because that's what employers want. Employers want the ability to tap into a certain type of workforce, and they're now seeing regional centres of excellence, like we've seen in Leeds, or just variety of different types of students being educated and graduating at different levels, whether it be from a degree perspective or coming out ready to go into some form of degree apprenticeship into good, strong local markets. It's like a employer's utopia, really. They've got a choice on who they employ.
Leading on from that is not to think about office buildings as a 9 to 5 building, particularly when the education sector gets involved. And so we've been looking at spaces for universities to essentially deliver their apprenticeship degrees where the employment is located. So people might finish in the workplace at 4 o'clock and then do 4 till 7 downstairs in more education-focused spaces, but in the same building or the same suite of buildings. So, again, that offer that employers then have is not just about giving someone a job, but actually offering qualifications that can be delivered, on the doorstep for them as well, which is a really nice way of joining things up.
Yeah, no, you're right. And there's some wonderful examples of this. So in Nottingham Trent University bought outright the former HMRC campus, which is out of town, redundant office buildings. If you and I were looking at this from scratch, that's going to have a new digital campus on site, and that's going to be a home for not just, like you say, teaching space, but also for businesses to house. Whether they are kind of new fledgling businesses looking for some form of kind of upstart, or larger businesses just trying to kind of capture and cajole that skill force coming through. So there's a real use of these out of town locations into a slightly different model, but it's going to ultimately mold into not just academia, but also newer office environments.
We're coming to the end of the podcast now. Where do we think workplace design is going next? What's the kind of next evolution of kind of workplace design?
I think it's going to be more of a continuation of some of the trends that we've already set. And the office is always going to need to offer something that the home environment, the home workspace can't offer. So it is about attracting people, and that is going to be key. There is going to still be a drive for more efficient buildings. We haven't really talked much about the EPC today, but obviously EPC, we're on a journey to net carbon zero 2050. By 2027, we need to be at EPC C, EPC B by 2030. And that's just that evolution of making buildings more efficient to meet those targets, so we don't have stranded buildings that we can't let out, is going to be key. For me, it's about quality of space. It's not about quantity.
Again, for me, looking ahead a little bit, completely rethinking some of our existing buildings in the city. Creating great places, great spaces, but using as little energy as possible to actually deliver those. And I think that conversation has evolved. That was a specialist conversation for scientists. Now, as designers, we're much more involved with that conversation. We're seeing much more creativity coming into a resolution of what makes for a really energy efficient building. We probably relied too much on technology to deliver that 5-10 years ago. Now we're actually relying much more heavily on really nicely, well-crafted, well-thought-out design solutions to help us get to where we need to be.
For me, very simplistically, sustainability is not going away. It's only going to get more prevalent to all aspects of design. We're going to see cities grow, and I mean geographically grow. So do we really care about what a CBD is at the moment? Not really. We've seen the likes of Birmingham and Leeds and Manchester grow physically outside of that CBD into areas where, again, a number of years ago, we would never have thought would be seen as an area of regeneration where people would like to live and work. But we are seeing that now, and that's only going to go one way. I would like to see the continued clustering of different uses and different sectors, because I think that drives demand. So we've spoken about academia. I think healthcare is going to come into that as well. I think healthcare will be quite dominant in mixed use sites. So both in terms of residential, healthcare use, academia, and then office space. And I think there'll be lots of collaboration of different companies merging with those different sectors, doing lots of great things. And that for me is really exciting. And how do you curate a place to entice and house that type of entity? So that for me is where I see yourself going.
Okay, thanks very much, everybody. That brings us to the end of today's episode of the AHR podcast. Big thank you to David, to Rob and Simon for joining us and sharing us their experiences. It's good to hear that clearly the office sector is not dead, and there's a lot of activity and a lot of thinking going into new spaces and reuse of existing spaces. We hope our listeners have enjoyed this episode. You can find all our podcast episodes on our website, or you can subscribe via your preferred podcast platform. Thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to joining us again next time.